Sometimes death is just a few feet away around every corner. But if you're smart, you might just be able to avoid it. And today's story is about a girl who did just that. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of true crime, mysteries, and strange occurrences, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and share it with a friend. And now that you've done so, let's open the vault. This is one of the creepiest real-life horror stories you will ever hear. One Tuesday in March, a woman named Kelsey made plans to go shopping with her good friend named Julie. Kelsey lived a little ways outside of the city in a small remote town, while her good friend Julie lived actually in the city. And because of this slight distance barrier, the two girls actually hadn't seen each other in a little while, because it took about an hour to an hour and a half to drive from Kelsey's house in the country over to Julie's house in the city. But nonetheless, on this particular Tuesday, Kelsey and Julie made plans to meet up with each other in the city, and they were planning on spending the day together. And that's exactly what they did. The two girls spent the day going to the movies, checking out different coffee shops, shopping at malls and department stores for clothes, and just generally having a really good time. The two women actually had such a good time that before they even realized it, it was getting later on into the night. Kelsey looked at the time on her phone and she realized that it was past 11 p.m. So she told Julie that this has been really fun, but it was probably a good idea for them to start heading back. And Julie agreed, so the two girls actually went back to Julie's house because Kelsey had left her car at Julie's house so the two girls could use one car as they toured around the city for the day. So when they got back to Julie's house, Kelsey and Julie got out of the car and they gave each other a hug, and Julie told Kelsey that this had been so much fun and that they should definitely do it again sometime. And then Kelsey got into her own car and she began that hour-and-a-half drive back to her own house. But as Kelsey began the drive back to her own house, she realized that not only was it past midnight at this point, but it was anything but a clear night. Instead, a deep fog had set in over the road, and this made it nearly impossible for Kelsey to see more than a few feet in front of her. This was extremely annoying because it meant that the drive back to her home was going to take even longer than she had originally expected. But nonetheless, Kelsey drove on and she did her best to keep her eyes focused on the road in front of her. At this time of night, the highway that Kelsey was on was almost completely dead, and it was rare to even see a single car pass by while she was driving. And as Kelsey drove, she began to feel herself nodding off, and then she would suddenly jerk herself awake and remember that she was still driving. And she was doing everything in her power to stay awake, but it had been a long day out in the sun with her friend, and the thick fog that her car was passing through felt almost hypnotizing as she drove down the lonely road. So Kelsey was still driving and struggling to try to stay awake when all of a sudden she sees illuminated out of the fog a car that was pulled over on the road in front of her. But whoever was driving this car in front of her was either not expecting anybody to come up behind them, or they were purposely trying to cause a hazard, because the way that they were pulled over on the side of the road was like halfway on the shoulder of the highway and halfway just in the lane. So as Kelsey was driving past, she had to swerve out of the way into the other lane and slam on her brakes to avoid hitting this car. This instantly woke Kelsey up with a sharp adrenaline rush, and once she got back in her lane, she knew that she just needed to pull over for a second and get her bearings. So Kelsey just pulled her car a little bit off to the side of the road and put the car in park, and then she just put her head in her hands because she couldn't believe how close she was to just hitting that car behind her. And as Kelsey was sitting in her car, she looked in her rearview mirror and she saw that the car she had almost hit was now driving up beside her. But at this point, the car had pulled all the way off to the shoulder of the road and was coming up to the side of her car on the passenger side. And as Kelsey looked at this car that was pulled up beside her, she realized that the driver's window was rolled down on the car and he was hand gesturing for her to follow him. So Kelsey now realized that her car was now, like his had been, kind of parked halfway on the shoulder of the highway and halfway in the lane. So she realized that he probably wanted her to pull off the road into safety, and then he was probably going to apologize for the near miss that he had just caused. So Kelsey gave the other driver a thumbs up to signify that she understood what he was saying, and then she followed him as he pulled off in front of her, and the two cars parked safely off of the road. And as Kelsey pulled off the road behind this other car, she immediately sees that the driver door of the other car was opening, and out steps this tall man in a big winter jacket and blue jeans, and he begins walking up towards her car. This man looked like he was about in his mid-30s, and he had a big smile on his face as he hurriedly made his way over to her car and motioned for her to roll down her driver's window. Kelsey wasn't completely comfortable talking to this strange man at 1 o'clock in the morning in the middle of an abandoned highway, but she figured it was only polite and that he probably wanted to apologize for the way he had parked his car, so she rolled down her window just a crack. But when the man got to her window, he motioned for her to roll her window down all the way. This made Kelsey very uneasy, and she shook her head no and told him that she could hear him just fine. And the man asked her where she was going at such a late hour, and Kelsey told him that she was heading home. And the man said, this fog doesn't look like it's going to be letting up anytime soon. It's probably not going to be safe to drive until morning. We just had a pretty scary near miss back there, and I would hate for anything to happen to you. And Kelsey wanted to say, well, yeah, we just had a pretty scary near miss because you were parked on the side of the road like a total jackass. But she didn't say that. She just said, yeah, it's pretty foggy and it's kind of difficult to see, but I'm being very careful and I'm sure I'll be just fine. But when the man heard this, he just raised his eyebrows and said, if you're just fine, then why did you pull over? Kelsey didn't want to start anything with this man, so she just lied to him and told him that she had received a phone call on her phone, and that's why she had pulled over to take the phone call. And the man gave her a strange look as if he knew that she was lying, and he said, look, I don't feel comfortable with you driving alone on this highway in the middle of the night. Listen, I live just a few miles away with my wife and my son. Why don't you come over to my house for a few hours, get some sleep, and then you can just drive safely home in the morning? Now at this point, Kelsey was getting a bad feeling about this guy, and she shook her head and she said, no thanks, I'll be fine. But this man was not taking no for an answer. He told her, don't you know that you're 10 times more likely to die in a car crash if you're driving while you're tired on this dark, foggy highway? Come on, just come home with me for a few hours, get some sleep, and then you can drive home when it's safe. So finally, Kelsey had to stand her ground and be stern with this man, and she just looked at him and said, no, I'm not going to your house. And as soon as she said this, the man's kind demeanor went away, and he made a gesturing motion to his car, and then he began pulling on the door handle of Kelsey's car, trying to open her driver's side door. Thankfully, Kelsey had the good sense to lock all of her doors before the strange man came up to her car, so his attempts to open her driver's side door were not successful. But even though, at this point, the man knew that the door was locked, he continued to pull away on her driver's door as if it would suddenly open for him. And while Kelsey was frantically rolling up her window and telling the man to stop, she looked through her windshield and she saw another man coming out of the passenger seat of that other car, and this man was running right at her car holding a baseball bat. At this point, Kelsey screamed and she threw her car in reverse and slammed on the gas as hard as she could. And when she did so, the first man that was holding onto her driver's door let go as the car backed up, and the other man who was coming at her car with the baseball bat took a wild swing at her car, but luckily he missed as Kelsey sped backwards. And Kelsey didn't think twice. As soon as she was a few yards away from the men, she slammed on her brakes, threw the car in drive, and sped onto the highway as fast as her car could possibly go. And Kelsey just kept driving and driving, leaving the two men behind her, and she continued driving the last 30 minutes or so back to her home. And now Kelsey says she wonders whether those two men attempted to stop any other women that night, and what would have happened to her if she would have rolled her window down all the way, or if she had failed to lock her doors. So that's it, guys. Thank you for watching another episode of Storyvolt. If you liked this video, please consider, liking this video, dropping a comment, and maybe subscribing to the channel. I hope you enjoyed this episode. That's it for today. I'll see you next time. But until then, be safe out there. You never know who's trying to kill you.